Advice with this particular reading is that you do it from the curriculum. It's a fairly long reading, but those of you who are now at level 2 or level 3 realize that ethics is difficult in the sense that there are so many different scenarios and circumstances which makes this topic quite subjective. And the best way to get a grasp on this material is to read it from the curriculum. You will notice that for each standard, and when I say standard here, I'm actually referring to a substandard. You might recall from the previous reading that standard 1 is professionalism, and then standard 1A is knowledge of the law. So here, when I say standard, I'm referring to a substandard such as knowledge of the law. In the curriculum, for every standard, you will find some guidance which explains that standard in detail. And then for most standards, there are some recommended procedures for compliance. In this particular lecture, I will try to emphasize the main points related to every single standard. Now, in the curriculum, after the guidance and recommended procedures, for each standard, there is a segment called application of the standard. Here you will find several examples related to that particular standard. And those examples are very scenario based. So you will be given a scenario or a situation, and then ideally you should be going through those scenarios and then thinking about whether the standard has been violated or not, and what is the appropriate course of action for the protagonist in that scenario. In fact, I'd recommend that you imagine yourself being the protagonist. And then after thinking about the appropriate course of action and whether the standard has been violated or not, then you should read the comment under each scenario. If you are simply listening to my lecture, then the way you need to work through this is listen to the main points. If you have time, also read from the curriculum, but if you don't have much time, then at the very least, go through the application of the standard section for every single standard. In this particular lecture, I'm not going to explain all the terminology. This is because students at level 2 and 3 will already be familiar with the terminology, and even level 1 candidates who have a finance background will be familiar. But let's say that you are getting started with your level 1 studies and you do not have a finance background, then there will be terms that you might not have heard of. For example, I might refer to an oversubscribed IPO. What I want you to do is, whenever you come across a term that you don't know, look it up. And one of the best places to go is investopedia.com, or you can simply Google the term. And by developing an understanding of the various terms, that not only will help you with ethics, but it will also build your finance general knowledge, and this will support you later as you go through the CFA program. I would also recommend that you go to the CFA Institute website, and there you can search for online courses offered by the CFA Institute website. There are several good online courses that are offered completely free. All the ethics and standards courses are free. In fact, for each of the 7 standards, there is a course, and you should do each of those. The good thing about these online courses is that they explain the main points, and they also give you several scenarios and examples and practice questions. So I would highly recommend this, not just for level 1 candidates, but also for level 2 and level 3 candidates. Let us now discuss the standards. So here are the 4 standards associated with professionalism. We've talked about these briefly in the previous reading, and now we will discuss them in detail. So standard 1A, knowledge of the law. Members and candidates, so that's you, must understand and comply with all applicable laws, rules, and regulations of any government, regulatory authority, licensing agency, or professional association governing their professional activities. That for you would be CFA Institute. In the event of conflict, members and candidates must comply with the most strict law, rule, or regulation. Members and candidates must not knowingly participate or assist in and must disassociate from any violation of such laws, rules, or regulations. If you look at this standard carefully, 3 points are being made. The first point is that you must understand and comply with the law. Now, obviously, this is important. In any profession, you need to understand the relevant legal context and you need to then follow the law. And I'll give you a simple example here. Let's say that you are operating in a country where very recently certain laws have been passed about the usage of social media. And let's say that you have been communicating your investment research through Facebook and Twitter, and you are not aware of the recent laws which have been passed with regards to the dissemination of investment opinions or investment research using social media. Now, if you are not aware of these laws that have been passed, then you are in violation of Standard 1A. So this is point number one, that you need to know the law. If you say that you do not know the law or you are not aware, that is not a valid excuse. The second point is that if there is a conflict between the law and what is stated in the code and standards, then you must follow the more strict interpretation. That's this point over here. And then the third is that you must not knowingly participate or assist in, and you must disassociate from any violation of such laws, rules, or regulations. All right, now what I will do is take the guidance segment in the curriculum and highlight the most important points. The first one has to do with the relationship between the code and standards. So this is the CFA Institute Code and Standards and the applicable law. To understand this point, let's say that you are an investment advisor and you live in Malaysia. You are a Malaysian citizen and your clients are also based in Malaysia. So clearly, the laws of Malaysia related to investments and investment advice and investment research will apply to you. That then is the applicable law for you as someone operating in Malaysia. Given that you have also signed up for the CFA exam, you are now a candidate, so the code and standards also apply to you. The relationship between the code and standards and the applicable law is that whenever there is an area where there is a conflict between the applicable law and the code and standards, then you need to go with the stricter interpretation. Now, I'm not saying that this is the case, but let's say that the laws in Malaysia are extremely strict in terms of portfolio managers and investment advisors participating in IPOs. If the law in Malaysia says that investment advisors should not be participating in IPOs, whereas the code and standards does allow participation in IPOs given certain circumstances, then the stricter interpretation must be taken. In other words, you need to follow the applicable law. There might be other situations where something in the code and standards is stricter than the applicable law. In that scenario, you need to follow the code and standards. The next point has to do with investment products and applicable laws. Here, if you have the curriculum in front of you, I would refer you to Exhibit 1, which presents several scenarios. You might be a US citizen working in a different country, and let's say that you are selling your investment services and investment products in that particular region. So say you are currently based in Central Asia and you are selling investment services and products to various countries in Central Asia, but you are a US citizen and you also are pursuing the CFA charter, so the code and standards apply to you. Now, the question becomes, as a US citizen, do you follow the US law? Do you follow the law of the country where you are currently residing? Do you follow the laws of the country where you are selling your products and services? Do you follow the code and standards? So all this is explained in Exhibit 1. The simple high-level summary is that when in doubt, follow the strictest interpretation. But let us consider different scenarios. And the way Exhibit 1 is structured, and I'll just summarize this for you, we might have three kinds of countries. NS, which refers to a country with no securities laws or regulations. LS, where the securities related laws and regulations are less strict compared to the code and standards. And then MS, where the law is more strict than the code and standards. So I'll just go through some of the scenarios. Let's say you reside in NS. So this country has no standards when it comes to investment related work, but you do business in a country that is LS. In other words, this country where you do business has securities related laws, but those laws are less strict compared to the code and standards. So in this case, the applicable law for you, given that you are selling services in LS, the applicable law is LS, but what should you follow? You need to follow the higher standard or the most strict standard, which is what you get through the code and standards. Because when the code and standards is more strict than the applicable law, then you need to follow the CFA Institute code and standards. Another scenario is where you reside in NS, do business in MS or the country with laws that are more strict than the code and standards. Then what do? Then again, along the lines of following the most strict interpretation, you need to follow MS. We now come to the final part of 1A, which is that you must not knowingly participate or assist in, and you must disassociate from any violation of such laws, rules, or regulations. It is important to understand this term knowingly. Knowingly means something that you know or that you should know. Going deeper into this point, let's say that you suspect that a violation is taking place. Say you are in a supervisory position and someone who reports to you might have done something wrong. You are not sure, you just have a suspicion. Then the first thing that you can do is just ask. So in this case, you try to determine by speaking to the person concerned as to whether he or she has violated the standard in any way. But obviously, this might not always be possible. There might be situations where your colleagues or your supervisor might be doing something wrong, and it might also be the case that you are not sure whether a violation is taking place or not. If that is the scenario, or if that is the case, then it is perfectly acceptable to seek the advice of your firm's compliance department or legal counsel. In fact, over the years, I have seen several questions where the appropriate action is to go seek legal counsel. Let's now move to a situation where you have observed something wrong happening and you are convinced that it is a violation of the code and standards. So what do? The first thing is to try and stop the behavior. And obviously, if you are in a supervisory role, that might be possible. But if you are not, then you take the matter to your compliance department. So have a meeting with the appropriate person in the compliance department and inform them of what you have seen. So I'll just write that down as the compliance department. If necessary, you can seek independent legal counsel. Let's say that you speak to the compliance department and you do not get a satisfactory answer, and you suspect that maybe the compliance department either is too weak or is potentially involved. So what do? Then, according to the code and standards, the appropriate action is to seek independent legal counsel. And finally, if nothing happens and the activity that is clearly a violation of the code and standards continues to happen, then you should disassociate yourself from that activity. The next question becomes, what exactly does disassociation mean? The disassociation practices will differ on the basis of your role in the investment industry or your role in the organization. And disassociation may involve removing your name from written reports and recommendations. Disassociation may involve asking for a different assignment or refusing to accept a new client. If you feel that some activity is taking place with a current client that you are not comfortable with, then you can request that you be removed from that particular client. The extreme case of disassociation is where you resign from the organization. If you feel that something unethical or a violation of the code and standards is happening around you and you don't do anything, or let's say you just report to the legal department, the compliance department, and then just continue thinking that I have informed the relevant personnel, then that actually is considered illegal or unethical. If you do realize that a violation of the code and standards is taking place and you don't do much, so your inaction combined with continuing association with those involved in illegal or unethical conduct can be construed as participation or assistance in the illegal or unethical conduct. So far in the discussion, I have talked about reporting potential violations to the compliance department or the legal department and potentially seeking independent legal counsel. But the question is whether you as a candidate should report violations to CFA Institute. The answer is that CFA Institute encourages you to report violations, although the code and standards do not compel you or require you to do so. Also, the CFA Institute does not require that you report violations to the government or the regulatory authority unless mandatory under applicable law. In a sense, what CFA Institute is doing is leaving the judgment up to you. So if you feel it is appropriate to report to the law enforcement authority, then you can do so. But if you don't, that is not a violation of the code and standards. Now we come to the recommended procedures for compliance related to Standard 1A. Here we will talk about what it is that you should be doing. The first one obviously is stay informed. So you need to be aware of any new laws and regulations. In fact, you should establish and encourage your employer to establish a procedure by which all employees in your firm are regularly informed about changes in the applicable laws, rules, and regulations. Next point is review procedures. You should review the procedures of your company. These are the compliance related procedures. And you should also encourage your employer to review the firm's written compliance procedures on a regular basis in order to ensure that the procedures reflect the current law and provide adequate guidance to employees about what is allowed under the law and or the code and standards. Maintain current files. You should maintain or encourage your employer to maintain readily accessible current reference copies of the applicable laws and regulations. Legal counsel, and this is important. When you are in doubt about the appropriate action to take, it is recommended that you seek advice of the compliance team or the compliance person in your organization, or if the matter has legal implications, then speak to the legal counsel. Another scenario is where you believe that somebody else in the firm is violating the law or violating the code and standards. So here again, it makes sense to speak to the compliance department or the legal counsel. Disassociation. When disassociating from an activity that violates the code and standards, what you should do ideally is document the violation and urge your company or your firm to attempt to persuade the person who is committing the violation to stop doing so. The final set of points here relates specifically to what you should be advising and encouraging your firm to do. One point is that if a firm doesn't already have a code of ethics, then you should encourage your firm to do so. And if your firm is an investment management firm, then it can potentially adopt the research objectivity standards. What the firm might also do is force all the employees to follow the CFA Institute code and standards and so on. As discussed before, you should also encourage the firm to provide information on applicable laws and make sure that this information is easily available and disseminated through regular training courses and educational seminars. You should encourage your firm to establish procedures for reporting violations. In other words, it should be easy for an employee to report violations, because that in of itself becomes a deterrent for others to commit violations. What I now want you to do is open the curriculum and go through the application of standards. You will find several examples there, and read each example or scenario, think about the appropriate course of action and whether the standard has been violated or not, and then read the comment. You will notice eventually that on questions that you see at the end of this reading and then questions in mock exams and your actual exam, many of them are likely to be closely related to the examples and scenarios in this particular reading.